I never thought I'd hear the words, "You owe me money," from my own sister. Yet, there I was, sitting in my small apartment, coffee growing cold in my hand, while Sophie's text stared back at me like a neon sign. "You're responsible. You should pay me for everything I went through because you didn't stop this." My heart thudded in disbelief. I reread it, convinced I must have misread. But no, Sophie, my younger sister, 16 years younger than me and stubborn as a mule, was seriously claiming that I somehow owed her financial compensation for her teenage pregnancy. The absurdity of it hit me first, then the fury. I had been supportive in every way I could, listening to her fears, offering guidance, even accompanying her to doctor's appointments when our mom couldn't make it. And now she was framing me as some kind of negligent accomplice. I tossed my phone onto the couch, letting it thump against the cushions, and ran my hands over my face. My apartment, usually a sanctuary, felt suddenly claustrophobic. I had been pulled into something I hadn't anticipated. And it wasn't just a family problem, it was becoming a legal and financial headache. I thought back to the day Sophie told me she was pregnant. I had been sitting on my bed, hands clasped tightly around a mug of tea, listening as she shook and sobbed. "I don't know what to do, Lauren," she whispered. "I'm scared." I had held her, tried to calm her, and promised her that we would find a way forward together. I wasn't a parent to her, I reminded myself, but I had acted as responsibly as anyone could. I had provided support, guidance, and care without judgment. And somehow, she had twisted that support into a supposed debt. My mom had tried to mediate, of course. "Lauren, I know this is difficult, but Sophie feels hurt," she had said gently over the phone. The tone that always made me feel guilty, even when I knew I was in the right. "Maybe you could," I had stopped her before she could finish, because I didn't want to hear the inevitable suggestion that I somehow had to make it right with money. I wasn't going to be the scapegoat for a situation that Sophie had created herself. I loved her, yes, but there were limits, and this was one of them. Sophie, despite being my sister, had a way of twisting things. I remembered all the times she had acted impulsively, made decisions without considering consequences, and yet somehow positioned herself as the victim. I had spent hours, even years, trying to guide her, offering advice, and at times even paying out of my own pocket for emergencies or necessities. But this was something else entirely. She wasn't asking, she was demanding, and she was threatening legal action, or at least she implied it with that carefully chosen wording in her text. "You're responsible. You should pay me." It was manipulative, and I knew it. I spent the next hour pacing my apartment, trying to decide how to respond. I could ignore it, but I knew better than that. Sophie had a tendency to escalate if she sensed weakness or hesitation. And the fact that she had mentioned everything I went through hinted at financial and emotional claims she might bring up in a custody hearing for her child. I had anticipated supporting her in that process emotionally. But this attempt to coerce money felt like an entirely different level of entitlement. I sat down at my laptop and started drafting notes. What had I actually done? I had been there for doctor's appointments, school meetings, and moments of panic when she didn't know how to handle her pregnancy. I had given advice, lent an ear, and tried to prepare her for the responsibilities ahead. None of it was coercive or manipulative, it was support. And yet, she now framed it as a debt, as if my guidance, which she had solicited, had somehow cost her money that I was now supposed to reimburse. The logic made no sense, but I knew that logic rarely mattered when emotions ran this high. The text gnawed at me, not because I doubted my actions, but because of the implications. Sophie's child was still young, and there was a custody hearing looming. Could she try to leverage the claim of financial responsibility to strengthen her position? Was this an opening for her to gain more in court by presenting me as negligent or culpable? My mind raced through scenarios, legal implications, and family dynamics. I had to be prepared. I had to be careful, because this was more than an argument between sisters. It was a potential courtroom battle with emotional stakes and legal consequences. I called my friend and confidant, Marissa, who had always been my sounding board in family matters. "You won't believe this," I said, pacing, trying to calm my rising panic. I explained the text, my history with Sophie's pregnancy, and the looming custody hearing. Marissa listened patiently, then sighed. "Lauren, that's insane. You didn't cause this. You supported her. If she tries to claim money, that's just manipulation. But you need to document everything, TXDs, conversations, anything she might use against you." I nodded, feeling a flicker of relief that someone outside the family recognized the absurdity, and also the necessity of strategy. I spent the rest of the day organizing evidence screenshots of texts, past emails discussing her pregnancy, records of appointments I had attended with her, and notes of financial support I had given her voluntarily over the years. Everything was meticulous, clear, and documented. I knew that once we stepped into the custody hearing, there could be attempts to paint me as negligent. I wasn't going to be caught off guard. I wanted clarity, fairness, and above all, the ability to protect myself and my niece. That evening, I tried to prepare emotionally. I reminded myself of the love I had for Sophie, the care I had shown her, and the boundary I had to maintain. She was my sister, and I would support her child. But I would not allow myself to be exploited financially for something I had never caused. I made a list of talking points for the hearing: my involvement, the support I had provided, and a clear account of what was my responsibility and what was hers. Clarity, I knew, would be my strongest ally. As I sat down with my notebook, reviewing the events that had led to this moment, I realized that the custody hearing would be enlightening, not just for the legal resolution, but for revealing the true dynamics of responsibility, manipulation, and family boundaries. Sophie's claims were bold, entitled, and unfair, but they also gave me the opportunity to assert truth, set limits, and protect both myself and my niece. The path ahead was tense, emotionally charged, and uncertain, but I felt a flicker of resolve. I would face this head-on, armed with evidence, clarity, and the conviction that I was not to blame for someone else's choices. The days leading up to the custody hearing were some of the most emotionally draining I've ever experienced. Every time I spoke to my mom or even thought about Sophie, a knot tightened in my stomach. I kept replaying her text over and over in my mind. "You owe me money." The audacity of it. The way she tried to shift blame onto me for something I had no control over made my blood boil. And yet, there was a small, lingering pang of guilt I couldn't ignore. After all, she was my sister, and I had tried to guide her through her teenage pregnancy. Could I have done more? I revisited every conversation, every moment when she confided in me. I remembered sitting with her in the bathroom one night, holding her trembling hands as she cried, asking questions I wasn't sure how to answer. I had provided guidance, advice, and resources, but I hadn't stopped her from making her own choices. And why would I? She was young, yes, but she was making decisions about her life. I could support, but I couldn't control. Still, that tiny voice of doubt whispered, maybe you could have done more. At the same time, I couldn't ignore my anger. Sophie had made her choice, and now she was trying to extort me emotionally and financially. I felt a mixture of betrayal and frustration. Family dynamics are messy, but this felt beyond normal sibling tension. It was as if she had rewritten the past to suit her narrative, positioning herself as a victim and me as a negligent older sister. My mom tried to mediate, calling me to say she hoped we could find understanding. I appreciated her intentions, but I knew the hearing would be the only place that mattered where facts would override emotion. I spent long hours organizing everything for the hearing. Every text, every email, every note I had made over the years became evidence. I detailed my involvement with Sophie's pregnancy, the doctor's visits I had attended, the financial support I had voluntarily offered, the guidance I had provided. I made sure it was chronological, clear, and concise, because I knew that in court, clarity and organization were everything. Emotional narratives could be persuasive, but documented facts were harder to dispute. Evenings were the hardest. My mom tried to talk to me about Sophie, and I had to remain calm, listening to her worries without showing my frustration. Sophie, as far as I could tell, didn't realize how manipulative she was being, though she had to know on some level. She framed me as responsible for her circumstances, as if offering advice and emotional support translated to financial liability. It was surreal, and it made me question how people could justify such logic. Sleep was fleeting. I would lie awake, turning over different scenarios in my head. What if Sophie tried to claim that my support had been coercive? What if she accused me of interfering in a way that hurt her during her pregnancy? I had to prepare counterpoints, anticipate her claims, and make sure that the story I would present was both truthful and compelling. I realized that preparation wasn't just about facts, it was about tone, composure, and emotional resilience. I had to remain calm even when provoked, because any display of frustration could be twisted into evidence of conflict. I also reflected on my role as an aunt. My niece's well-being was central to everything I was doing. I wanted to support her emotionally and make sure her needs were prioritized, but I couldn't allow myself to be used as a financial scapegoat. The balance between care and boundaries became clear to me. I would be involved in her life, yes, but only within limits that respected both my resources and my autonomy. This realization gave me a quiet sense of strength, a knowledge that I could act decisively without guilt. Talking to friends helped too. I called Marissa often, explaining the family drama and my frustration. She reminded me repeatedly that I was not responsible for someone else's choices, no matter how much love I felt for them. Her perspective grounded me, helping me separate guilt from responsibility. I realized that while I had provided support, I had never had control over Sophie's decisions, and trying to retroactively assume that control was neither fair nor logical. I also prepared emotionally for Sophie herself. I knew she would try to appeal to emotion during the hearing, framing herself as helpless and me as uncaring. I practiced responding calmly, speaking from facts and experience without letting anger or hurt seep into my words. I wanted the judge to see me as rational, composed, and reliable a person who had supported her sister appropriately but was not complicit in any wrongdoing. I reminded myself constantly, composure was strength, and clarity was my ally. As the hearing approached, I felt a mix of anxiety and readiness. The tension within the family had been building for weeks, but now it would come to a head. I spent time visualizing the courtroom, imagining Sophie making her claims and me responding confidently, calmly, and factually. The rehearsal helped reduce some of the dread, replacing it with focus and determination. I wasn't going to be bullied or manipulated in a legal setting. I had spent too long documenting, preparing, and reflecting to allow my efforts to be undermined. In those quiet moments alone. I also allowed myself to grieve the relationship with Sophie as it had been. There was love, of course, but there was also tension, misunderstanding, and a growing sense that our connection was complicated by entitlement and resentment. I reminded myself that the hearing was not just about money, it was about setting boundaries, clarifying responsibilities, and ensuring that my niece's needs were met without compromising my own autonomy. By the night before the hearing, I felt a cautious sense of empowerment. I had organized evidence, prepared mentally and emotionally, and anticipated the manipulative tactics Sophie might employ. I knew the hearing would be intense, possibly uncomfortable, and emotionally taxing. But I also knew I was ready. I had practiced calm responses, outlined key points, and reminded myself constantly that I was not at fault. Finally, I went to bed early, exhausted but mentally rehearsed. I visualized the courtroom, the questions that might be asked, and the way I would present my role clearly and responsibly. I reminded myself that the outcome would depend not on guilt or blame, but on facts, preparation, and composure. As I drifted off to sleep, I felt a flicker of confidence that I could navigate this challenge without compromising my values, and that whatever happened, I would emerge clear-minded, prepared, and protective of my niece's well-being. The morning of the custody hearing, I felt a knot in my stomach that I couldn't shake. I had spent days preparing, rehearsing my words, organizing my evidence, and mentally steeling myself for Sophie's And yet, as I walked into the courthouse, the weight of the situation pressed on me like a physical force. People bustled past, lawyers and litigants rushing to their respective cases, while I clutched my folder of documents tightly, as if it were armor. I reminded myself that this was my moment to stand firm, to set boundaries, and to protect my niece. When we were called into the courtroom, Sophie was already there, sitting with her lawyer, dressed neatly, hair perfectly styled, and wearing that confident smirk that had always annoyed me. She looked like she had rehearsed this scene, as if she knew she would have my full attention and tried to command the narrative. My heart twisted briefly. There was love for her, yes, but also frustration that she could so casually twist reality to suit her claims. I reminded myself that my goal wasn't to win an emotional battle, but to present the facts clearly and objectively. The judge, a tall woman with kind eyes, addressed us, and I felt the tension in the room shift into focus. The proceedings began formally, but the personal undercurrents were unmistakable. Sophie's lawyer immediately opened with a description of her hardships, framing her teenage pregnancy as a burden she shouldn't have had to bear alone. My jaw tightened as I listened. I knew that she would paint me as a bystander who failed to intervene, and I braced myself to counter this without letting my emotions cloud my testimony. When it was my turn to speak, I stood, heart racing but voice steady. I introduced myself, my relationship to Sophie, and my involvement throughout her pregnancy. I explained that I had been present for appointments, offered guidance and emotional support, and provided assistance voluntarily, without expectation of compensation. I spoke slowly and deliberately, emphasizing facts and dates, keeping emotion at a minimum. Every word was chosen carefully, because I knew that this hearing would hinge on credibility and composure. Sophie's eyes narrowed as I spoke. I could feel her studying me, trying to find a crack in my confidence, a hint of doubt or guilt to exploit. I took a deep breath and continued, calmly recounting specific instances. The evening she first told me she was pregnant, the doctor visits I attended, the times I helped her navigate school obligations and doctor advice, and even small gestures like helping her set up a budget for baby supplies. I avoided editorializing or inserting emotion. The facts spoke for themselves, and I wanted the judge to see me as clear-minded and responsible. The lawyer asked Sophie to explain why she believed I was responsible for her financial situation. She launched into an impassioned narrative, describing moments of fear, shame, and isolation. My chest tightened as I listened. It was impossible to ignore the raw emotion, but I reminded myself to focus on what mattered, the facts and the boundaries. I wasn't there to invalidate her feelings, but to show that her claims of financial entitlement were unfounded. When cross-examined, I addressed each point methodically. I never coerced her, I said firmly, meeting the judge's gaze. I supported her choices as she requested guidance. At no point did I have the authority or the intent to prevent her decisions. I have always acted in good faith, out of care and concern, not obligation. I could see the judge nod slightly, acknowledging the clarity and honesty in my testimony. The courtroom felt heavy with tension, but I stood steady, grounded by the preparation I had invested so thoroughly. Sophie's lawyer tried to suggest that my support somehow obligated me financially, implying that by being involved, I had created a duty to cover expenses. I countered calmly, citing the voluntary nature of my involvement and emphasizing that any assistance I had provided was never contractual or demanded. Supporting someone emotionally does not translate into financial liability, I said, keeping my tone measured. My actions were guided solely by care for my sister and niece, not any expectation of repayment. Throughout the hearing, I noticed subtle shifts in body language, Sophie's confident smirk, faltering slightly when confronted with documented facts, her lawyer growing quieter as I presented my evidence. I had anticipated attempts at manipulation, emotional appeals, and subtle intimidation, and yet I found myself maintaining composure. It was empowering in a way I hadn't expected. This wasn't just about defending against false claims, it was about asserting truth, protecting boundaries, and demonstrating that love doesn't equate to financial liability. When it came time for me to answer questions about my niece's well-being, I spoke with a softer tone, acknowledging my care for her and my role in supporting her. I wanted to make it clear that I wasn't disinterested or cold. I explained that I had always prioritized her needs, attended important appointments, and helped Sophie navigate responsibilities, while maintaining appropriate boundaries regarding finances. The judge's attentive gaze reassured me that my testimony was landing as intended. Sophie's behavior fluctuated throughout the hearing. At times, she seemed defiant, arms crossed, eyes challenging me. At other times, she seemed vulnerable, tears welling as she recounted struggles. I observed her carefully, noting the inconsistencies between her narrative and the documented facts I had prepared. I remained neutral in expression, showing neither satisfaction nor resentment, because I knew that any reaction could be interpreted as bias or hostility. That by the time the morning session ended, I felt drained but focused. The hearing wasn't over, but I knew I had presented my case clearly, with evidence and composure. I had countered claims of financial obligation without diminishing my love for Sophie or my concern for my niece. I realized that while emotions in the courtroom could be persuasive, facts and clarity were ultimately what mattered most. I had laid a solid foundation for the judge to see truth over entitlement. As we left the courtroom for a short recess, Sophie shot me a glance that mixed anger, frustration, and maybe a flicker of begrudging acknowledgement. I met her eyes briefly and remained silent. There was no need for confrontation, no need for reaction. The facts were on my side, and the courtroom was the venue where they would speak louder than any sibling dispute or emotional appeal. I felt a cautious sense of satisfaction. I had maintained control of my narrative, upheld my boundaries, and presented myself as calm, rational, and responsible. Sitting quietly outside the courtroom, folder on my lap, I allowed myself a small exhale. The morning had been intense, emotionally charged, and exhausting. And yet, I felt empowered. I had anticipated every challenge, prepared meticulously, and maintained composure even in the face of emotional manipulation. The custody hearing was not just a legal proceeding, it was a stage for truth, clarity, and the assertion of personal boundaries. I was proud of how I had handled it, and I knew that whatever happened next, I had given my niece and myself the best possible representation. The second half of the custody hearing was where the real revelations began to unfold. As Sophie continued with her testimony, I watched the cracks in her narrative appear. She claimed I had been distant, uncaring, and financially negligent. But the evidence I had gathered told a completely different story. My organized notes, appointment records, and documented conversations made it difficult for her lawyer to maintain the argument that I had somehow failed my responsibilities. I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. Preparation was proving to be everything. The judge asked Sophie directly about financial support. Her voice wavered slightly, betraying uncertainty despite the confident tone she tried to project. I think Lauren should have given me more help. I mean, she was there, but not enough. The trailing off revealed her lack of clarity, and I knew immediately that my documentation could dismantle this claim. When my lawyer approached the bench with the organized folder of evidence, I felt a sense of calm certainty. Every point Sophie had made could be addressed factually, without argument or emotion. When it was my turn to speak again, I stood with deliberate composure. Your Honor, I began, voice steady. I have been fully involved in Sophie's life throughout her pregnancy. I attended medical appointments, assisted her with school responsibilities, and offered emotional support whenever she needed it. All assistance provided was voluntary and never in exchange for a financial obligation. I handed over the folder of evidence, letting the judge review the clear, chronological documentation. Sophie's lawyer shifted uncomfortably as the pages were examined. The judge flipped through the documents, nodding occasionally, asking questions to clarify details. Ms. Lauren, she said, can you confirm that all the support you provided was requested and that there was no expectation of repayment? I looked her directly in the eye. Yes, Your Honor. Every action was out of care and concern, not obligation. I never promised, nor was I ever asked, to provide ongoing financial support beyond what I voluntarily gave. The simplicity and clarity of my statement seemed to resonate, and I could see the judge jotting notes carefully. Next, the focus shifted to my niece and the father's involvement. Sophie's earlier statements had painted a picture of isolation, implying that Lauren's lack of financial contributions had created hardship. The judge asked Sophie to clarify the father's role, and suddenly, details emerged that complicated her story. She admitted that he had been somewhat involved, providing intermittent support, and that she had made decisions about the child's care and living arrangements without Lauren's interference. These admissions undermined the narrative of neglect she had tried to build against me. At this point, I felt a measure of relief but remained vigilant. Courtrooms have a way of turning quickly, and I couldn't allow myself to relax until the final decision. I calmly reiterated my involvement, emphasizing the distinction between emotional support and financial obligation. My lawyer highlighted the timeline of events, cross-referenced with Sophie's own admissions, showing clearly that I had been present, responsible, and supportive, but never financially indebted. The courtroom atmosphere shifted. Sophie's confident demeanor began to falter. During a brief recess, Sophie's lawyer tried to corner me outside the courtroom. Don't you feel any responsibility? He asked, leaning slightly forward. I met his gaze steadily. I feel responsibility for my niece's well-being. Absolutely. But I do not have a financial obligation for choices that Sophie made independently. My role has always been support, guidance, and care, not payment for her decisions. He didn't respond. Clearly frustrated, and I returned to my seat. Calm and focused. When the hearing resumed, the judge addressed Sophie directly, questioning inconsistencies in her narrative. I watched as her face registered frustration and embarrassment, realizing that the evidence and testimony were not aligning with the story she had tried to present. Every manipulated statement she had made crumbled under the weight of documented facts. I felt a quiet vindication, not gloating, but the reassuring knowledge that truth had a way of revealing itself. When presented clearly and methodically, the turning point came when Sophie's emotional appeals faltered under. She tried to imply that my voluntary support had created some implied financial obligation. But I calmly explained that guidance and care are not equivalent to monetary debt. I illustrated examples where I had assisted without expectation, contrasted with moments where she had made independent choices that were hers alone to bear. The judge nodded, asking pointed questions that highlighted the distinction between personal responsibility and my voluntary involvement. By mid-afternoon, the courtroom tension was palpable. Sophie's frustration was visible. She shifted in her seat, eyes darting toward me with a mixture of anger and disbelief. I remained composed, quietly observing, letting the facts speak. The judge turned toward me and asked one final question. Do you accept responsibility for any financial obligation regarding this child? I shook my head firmly. No, Your Honor. I accept responsibility for supporting my niece emotionally and being present in her life. Financial responsibility lies with the parents and guardians, not with a sibling who offered guidance. That statement seemed to seal the matter. The judge leaned back, thoughtfully reviewing the evidence, Sophie's statements, and my testimony. I could feel a shift in the room. Sophie's narrative of entitlement had been dismantled. My heart beat steadily, a mix of relief and quiet triumph. I realized that I had navigated the situation carefully, balancing love, responsibility, and boundaries without letting frustration or emotion cloud my clarity. Finally, the judge requested closing statements. My lawyer summarized my involvement succinctly, emphasizing voluntary support, factual assistance, and the absence of any financial obligation. Sophie's lawyer attempted one last appeal to sympathy, but the weight of evidence and testimony was undeniable. I listened, quietly confident, knowing that preparation, composure, and documentation had carried the day. As the hearing concluded, Sophie avoided eye contact, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet recognition that she hadn't achieved the outcome she expected. I felt no triumph over her, only relief and satisfaction that the truth had been represented fairly. My niece's well-being had been central to my focus, and I had acted in her interest while maintaining clear boundaries with Sophie. It was a balance I had strived for, and finally, it had been recognized. Walking out of the courthouse, folder in hand, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The tension, anxiety, and emotional strain of the past weeks were lifting. I had been tested, forced to defend my actions, and confront manipulation head-on, and I had emerged not only intact, but empowered, clear-minded, and protective of my niece's future. I realized that standing firm, documenting facts, and maintaining composure was more powerful than any emotional appeal or manipulation. The moment the judge announced the custody decision, I felt a rush of relief and quiet vindication wash over me. Sophie's claims that I owed her money or had somehow failed in my role as a sister were dismissed entirely. The judge acknowledged my consistent involvement in my niece's life, the voluntary nature of my support, and the thorough documentation I had provided. No financial obligation was assigned to me, and the custody arrangement was clarified in a way that prioritized the child's well-being while respecting boundaries. I exhaled deeply, feeling years of tension release in that single breath. Sophie's reaction was subtle but telling. She slumped slightly in her chair, her earlier defiance gone, replaced by the reluctant acceptance that the courtroom had not validated her narrative. I didn't gloat. There was no need. The truth had been spoken, and the fairness of the process mattered far more than any sense of personal triumph. I felt compassion for her, despite her manipulation, recognizing that her struggle as a young mother was real, even if her accusations against me were unfounded. As we left the courthouse, I saw my mom waiting outside, her expression a mix of pride and relief. We embraced, both of us silently acknowledging the emotional weight of the morning. She whispered, "You did the right thing, Lauren. You stayed calm, honest, and strong." Her words touched me deeply. It was not just the validation of my preparation and composure, but also the reassurance that I had acted responsibly, ethically, and with love intact. I realized in that moment that this ordeal had strengthened not just my resolve, but our family bond. Reflecting on the experience, I recognized just how much I had grown. I had faced a manipulative narrative head-on, prepared meticulously, and maintained clarity and composure in a high-stakes emotional environment. I had balanced empathy with boundaries, care with assertiveness. I understood now that supporting someone does not equate to financial responsibility, and that standing firm does not mean being unkind. These lessons, hard-won and deeply personal, would stay with me for the rest of my life. In the days following the hearing, I spent time reconnecting with my niece in ways that felt natural and joyful. I attended school events, helped with homework, and shared quiet moments of play and conversation. These interactions were not just acts of care, but affirmations of the boundaries I had set. I realized that love and support could coexist with limits, and that the most meaningful assistance was often emotional rather than financial. I reveled in the simplicity and authenticity of these moments, free from the tension that had dominated the past weeks. Sophie, meanwhile, slowly adjusted to the reality of the decision. At first, there was awkwardness and residual resentment, but over time, I noticed her tone soften, her reliance on manipulation diminish. I didn't take this as an invitation for reconciliation or renewed trust immediately. Boundaries, once violated, take time to rebuild. But I allowed myself to hope that she could learn from the experience, that clarity, fairness, and consequence might teach her responsibility without resentment festering. I also reflected on the broader implications for family dynamics. I realized that responsibility, accountability, and boundaries are essential for healthy relationships. Too often, emotional bonds are manipulated under the guise of need or entitlement. But fairness requires recognizing limits and acting with integrity. I felt proud that I had navigated this delicate balance successfully, advocating for my niece while protecting myself from unfounded financial and emotional claims. Talking with friends and family afterward, I shared some of the lessons I had learned. I explained the importance of documentation, preparation, and calm composure in situations involving manipulation or high-stakes family conflict. I described how empathy and assertiveness could coexist and how standing firm in truth does not negate care or love. Their admiration and validation reinforced my own sense of empowerment, reminding me that preparation and clarity are among the most potent tools we possess in navigating complex interpersonal challenges. Emotionally, I felt a weight lift that had been pressing on me for weeks. Fear, frustration, and anxiety had dominated my thoughts, clouding judgment and limiting peace of mind. Now, with the hearing behind me and the truth recognized, I felt light and centered. I could focus on relationships with my niece and family without the looming shadow of unfair financial claims or manipulative narratives. The clarity of resolution provided space for growth, connection, and emotional restoration. Looking back, I realized this experience had changed me in profound ways. I had confronted manipulation directly, maintained unwavering composure under pressure, and ensured that boundaries were respected while love remained intact. I had witnessed firsthand how preparation, evidence, and calm advocacy could protect relationships and preserve integrity. These were lessons that transcended this specific family dispute, offering wisdom applicable in professional, social, and personal contexts. I also reflected on my relationship with Sophie with greater nuance. Love for her remained, but it was tempered by a recognition of limits and the need for accountability. I hoped that in time, she might understand the lessons inherent in this experience, that support is not synonymous with obligation, that boundaries are essential for healthy interaction, and that manipulation ultimately undermines trust. My role as her sister was evolving, informed by experience and grounded in clear principles of fairness and responsibility. By the end of the week, life began to return to a sense of normalcy. I found joy in routine moments with my niece, in small interactions that reminded me why I had fought so hard, not for victory, but for protection, clarity, and the nurturing of genuine relationships. I realized that while the ordeal had been exhausting and emotionally taxing, it had also illuminated my own strength, resilience, and ability to act decisively under pressure. Sitting quietly one evening, watching my niece play on the floor, I allowed myself a moment of gratitude. Gratitude for clarity, for boundaries, and for the ability to stand firm without compromising love. Gratitude for the lessons learned about responsibility, family, and integrity. And gratitude for the knowledge that I had handled a deeply challenging situation with courage, composure, and unwavering commitment to what was right. As I reflected, I knew that this experience would stay with me forever. It was a reminder that standing firm in truth, protecting one's boundaries, and acting with integrity are not just practical necessities, they are acts of love. The custody hearing had been enlightening in ways I hadn't anticipated. It had shown me the power of preparation, the importance of calm composure, and the enduring strength of family when boundaries are respected. In the quiet aftermath, I felt empowered, centered, and ready to face the future. Sophie, my niece, and I had reached a point of clarity. The drama and tension had given way to understanding, boundaries, and the reaffirmation of love tempered by responsibility. I had emerged stronger, wiser, and fully aware of my own limits and capabilities. And most importantly, I had ensured that my niece's well-being would be nurtured without compromising my integrity, resources, or peace of mind.